On a December night in Petrograd, when the Neva ran black under plates of ice and the city's lamps seemed to burn with a weary wartime sting, a peasant in a fur coat was led down the stairs of a palace on the Moika. Prince Felix Yusupov, silk at the cuffs, terror in the throat, played the host with a trembling courtesy, offering wine and cakes in a room contrived to look like warmth. Grigory Rasputin, heavy-lidded, bearded, and oddly unhurried, ate and drank with the appetite of a man who had made peace with both sin and providence. He crossed himself, muttered a blessing that sounded half like prayer and half like spell, and looked at his young, noble companion with a calm that, in the retelling, would become fable. Above them, in the upper rooms, footsteps paused and resumed. Outside, a sleigh waited. And in the corridors of power, an ancient monarchy, already wounded by war and distrust, leaned, unawares, toward its last abyss. It is tempting, and it has been the habit of history's popularizers, to make Rasputin the explanation of the Romanovs' fall. A single dark star by whose malign gravity an empire was pulled from its orbit. But revolutions are not so economical. They are prepared by hunger, by misrule, by war, by the slow erosion of confidence, and by the despair that comes when institutions seem to exist only for themselves. Rasputin, rather than causing the collapse, became the monarchy's most vivid symbol, a human allegory of the distance between the glittering court and the immense suffering land. A scandal so grotesque that it made the deeper scandals, poverty, repression, incompetence, feel intimate and undeniable. He entered Russian history at the moment when the old faith and the old authority were most in need of miracle and least able to bear the cost of being seen to depend on one. He was born in 1869 in Pokrovskoye, a Siberian village on the Tura River, one of those settlements where the earth is honest, the winters are long, and the peasant's imagination, starved of books and crowded with icons, is at once practical and apocalyptic. The Russia that formed him was still the Russia of wooden churches and vast distances, of priests who baptized and buried and seldom instructed, of a people for whom God was near but the state was remote, arriving chiefly as tax, conscription, or policeman. In such soil, mysticism grows like rye, not as a philosophy, but as a hunger, not as a doctrine, but as a mood. Rasputin's early reputation, by most accounts, mingled petty crime, drinking, and the coarse liberties of a strong village man with a sudden volcanic turn toward religion. Whether this conversion was the remorse of a guilty conscience or the discovery of a talent, we cannot know. Perhaps it was both. Many saints, when stripped of their halos, appear as men who found in the language of God a discipline for their disorder and a stage for their gifts. He became what Russia, in its own spiritual tradition, calls a stranic, a wanderer, moving from shrine to shrine, monastery to monastery, absorbing the cadences of prayer and the psychology of confession. It is in such pilgrimage that charisma is trained. The voice learns how to speak to the fearful. The eyes learn how to hold a gaze until it feels like grace. The hands learn the slow authority of blessing. Tales gathered around him, some devout, some obscene, many contradictory, of visions and healings, of ecstatic sects and moral license. The line between sanctity and scandal is thin in any society that expects the holy man to be a vessel of God rather than a product of discipline. And in Russia, where the people's piety often bypassed the formal clergy and clung instead to the starets, the elder, the spiritual guide, that line was thinner still. Rasputin did not rise through seminaries, he rose through need. Petrograd, when he arrived in the capital's orbit in the early years of the century, was a city split against itself. The Europe of boulevards and French phrases laid like a mask upon an Asiatic immensity, factories and slums swelling at the edges of palaces, a literate intelligentsia arguing doctrines while peasants prayed for rain. In such a metropolis, the fashionable classes, bored with their own sophistication and frightened by the tremors of modernity, often turned to the people as to a tonic, collecting folk songs, worshipping the peasant as an elemental purity, or, in a darker turn, seeking in the peasant mystic a rough antidote to rational doubt. Rasputin's very uncouthness became a credential. He smelled of stable and field. He spoke in proverbs. He wept in prayer. He could be tender with women in a way that made some feel spiritually chosen and others feel merely handled. He entered drawing rooms not as an equal, but as an exotic, and in that humiliation he learned his revenge, the knowledge that the powerful are often more credulous than the poor because their lives have insulated them from ordinary tests. Through a chain of introductions, clergy, society women, those intermediaries who live by turning access into influence, Rasputin approached the most vulnerable point in the Russian state, the private agony of the imperial family. Nicholas II, conscientious in the small duties of a sovereign and timid before the large, had inherited a throne that demanded genius and offered him only sincerity. His wife, Alexandra, brought to Russia the intensity of a convert, German by birth, Russian by marriage, Orthodox by adoption. She clung to faith with the desperation of one who felt herself perpetually judged by a suspicious nation. Their only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a disease that turns the smallest bruise into terror and a child's play into a mother's vigil. In courts, as in cottages, pain makes theologians, and when doctors fail, the mind returns to the oldest remedy, the hope that someone, somewhere, has the favor of heaven. Rasputin's access to the family is inseparable from Alexei's illness. What occurred in those rooms, the whispered prayers, the mother's imploring eyes, the court physician's anxious helplessness, was not politics at first, but tragedy. Several times, when the boy's bleeding threatened his life, Rasputin seemed to calm the crisis. A modern mind will look for mechanisms, suggestion reducing panic, rest enforced, perhaps the cessation of medicines that worsen bleeding, the soothing of a mother whose agitation transmits itself to a child. But a mother does not need a mechanism. She needs a reprieve. To Alexandra, Rasputin became not an advisor, but an answer, a living proof that God had not abandoned the dynasty. She called him our friend. She listened to his messages with a gravity that made them state papers, and as war and rumor tightened around the throne, she clung to him more fiercely, as if the scandal he caused were less terrible than the despair his absence would bring. Here, the personal began to corrupt the political. Nicholas and Alexandra were not monsters. They were, in many ways, the opposite. A couple in love, devoted to their children, earnest in their religion, and catastrophically unfit for the violent modern world. Their goodness, being private, could not redeem their public errors. Russia was already strained by the defeats and humiliations of the early 20th century, by the half-granted liberties after 1905, by the bitterness of a peasantry still aching from land hunger, and by an industrial working class discovering its collective strength. When the Great War came, it magnified every weakness: supply failures, incompetent administration, the loss of millions in casualties, and the sense that the state could demand everything and provide almost nothing. Nicholas, in a gesture of chivalric duty and political folly, took personal command of the army, leaving the capital to Alexandra, who, in turn, leaned upon Rasputin as if he were a bridge to God, and therefore a bridge to policy. Rasputin did not invent Russia's governmental chaos, but his presence made it theatrical. He became entangled, whether by intention, by manipulation from those around him, or by the sheer momentum of his access, in the appointments and dismissals of ministers. Men sought his favor, others feared his displeasure, And the imperial couple, increasingly isolated from sober counsel, interpreted criticism of Rasputin as an assault on the family's faith and on the sanctity of their suffering. In a state already corroded by autocratic secrecy, the spectacle of a peasant holy man influencing court decisions was intolerable. The aristocracy saw in him a humiliation, the Duma saw in him a threat, the public saw in him a sign that the palace had become a chamber of superstition. Rumor, history's most democratic weapon, made him into a satyr, a spy, a sorcerer, a German agent, a corrupter of women, a corrupter of the throne. Some of these accusations were likely false, some were likely exaggerated. Enough were plausible to destroy trust. When a regime depends on reverence, it cannot survive ridicule. Rasputin's own behavior supplied the tinder. He moved through the capital with a swagger that mingled peasant cunning and newfound impunity. He drank, he boasted, he cultivated the role that scandal assigned him, as if to dominate the narrative by embodying it. He drew to himself a circle of admirers, especially women of society and women of the streets, who sought either salvation or sensation. He spoke in the language of repentance, but seemed to treat repentance as a license, sin deeply, then wash it away in tears. Such a theology, or such a caricature of theology, is old and seductive. It gives the appetites the halo of destiny. Whether Rasputin consciously preached a doctrine that one must descend into sin to rise into grace, or whether this was an after-the-fact justification offered by disciples and enemies alike, the effect was the same. The city's gossip found in him an inexhaustible plot. The state, clumsy even when it wished to be subtle, alternated between surveillance and indulgence. Churchmen debated him. Some denounced him as a fraud. Others defended him as a simple instrument of God. Still others feared him because he exposed the clergy's own distance from the people. Police reports multiplied. Whispers reached the palace. But Alexandra's faith, sealed by her child's blood, was not a thing that documents could dissolve. Rasputin survived denunciations and inquiries, and in surviving them he seemed to grow. Power, even when borrowed, has the peculiar effect of making the holder appear ordained. In 1914, as if to foreshadow the empire's own wound, Rasputin was stabbed by a woman, Kionia Guseva, in his Siberian village. He lived, though gravely injured. For the court, his survival was another sign. For his enemies, another provocation. War began, the world burned, and Rasputin, restored, returned to Petrograd into an atmosphere so charged that every conversation sounded like conspiracy. Some say he opposed the war, warning that it would destroy Russia. If so, his warning, once again, was read not as prudence, but as treason, because it seemed to align with the empire's enemies and with Alexandra's German origins. In those years, the Russian mind, exhausted by loss, began to look for a single villain to contain its diffuse anger. Rasputin was convenient because he was visible, and because his visibility could be linked, through Alexandra, to the sacred privacy of the throne. The decision to kill him, therefore, grew in a soil of patriotism, class pride, and despair. The conspirators were men of high birth and high resentment. Prince Yusupov, married into the imperial family, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the politician Vladimir Purishkevich, and others drawn into the plot by the shared conviction that the monarchy could be saved only by severing this grotesque appendage. It is one of history's ironies that aristocrats, who had for centuries upheld autocracy, now committed murder in the name of preserving it. They were not revolutionaries, they were surgeons who believed the patient could still be saved by amputation. Their tragedy was that the disease was systemic. What happened in the Moika Palace has been told with such relish that it has become myth, poisoned cakes that failed to kill, shots fired, the victim rising again as if death were only a suggestion, a final bullet, a body thrown into the river, a last struggle under the ice. The truth, as often, is less theatrical and more grim. We know that Rasputin was lured there on the night of December 16th to 17th, 1916, old style, that he was shot, that he died, and that his body was disposed of in the Neva. Much of the detail comes from memoirs written afterward, when men have reasons to enlarge their courage, their drama, or their innocence. Even if we strip away the embellishment, the essential picture remains. The empire's elite, frightened of a peasant's influence and of what it signified, chose murder as a political remedy, thus adding one more crime to the long ledger that made the regime morally indefensible. The aftermath was swift in its symbolism and slow in its effect. Alexandra mourned as if a prophet had been taken. Nicholas, who might have recognized the warning, retreated into that fatal mixture of stubbornness and sadness that had become his character. The public, meanwhile, did not interpret Rasputin's death as purification. It interpreted it as confirmation that the court was rotten enough to need murder and weak enough to be penetrated by a peasant mystic. Within weeks and months, the pressures that Rasputin had helped to dramatize, military collapse, food shortages, the alienation of the educated classes, the wrath of workers and soldiers, became unmanageable. In March 1917, old-style February, the monarchy fell, and the conspirators, who had imagined themselves saving the throne, discovered that they had merely removed a symbol while the structure itself was already cracking. In judging Rasputin, it is easy to become moral and therefore shallow. He was not the Antichrist of wartime posters, nor the saint of desperate memoirs. He was a man formed by a religious culture that prized ecstasy and miracle, by a social order that denied intelligence to the poor and therefore treated their intuition as magic, by a court whose isolation made it yearn for the voice of the people in the most distorted form. He had gifts of attention, of presence, of psychological penetration that could, in another life, have made him a healer of souls. He also had vices, sensuality, vanity, a taste for domination, that made him a danger when placed near power. His greatest crime may have been not that he sought influence, but that he found it so easily in a dynasty so ill-equipped to resist the seductions of certainty. The Romanovs did not perish because Rasputin bewitched them. They perished because they could no longer persuade a nation. Yet Rasputin matters because he exposes in one figure the contradictions of late Imperial Russia, the peasant's hunger for holiness and the noble's hunger for novelty, the mother's love elevated into policy, the state's reliance on sacred authority in an age demanding competence, the old religion's comfort and its vulnerability to imposture, the aristocracy's contempt for the people and its secret dependence upon their imagined purity. When a society's institutions fail to provide justice and security, it will seek miracle, and when a government must borrow miracle to maintain legitimacy, it is already half dethroned. So the peasant's body, once dragged from the river and laid out under the gaze of officials, was more than a corpse. It was a mirror. In the hard winter of 1916, as Petrograd shivered and the front bled and the palace whispered, Russia looked into that mirror and saw, blurred by rumor, sharpened by resentment, its own decay. The tale that followed was not Rasputin's alone. It was the closing chapter of an autocracy that had confused faith with policy, secrecy with strength, and dynasty with nation, and the opening chapter of a revolution that, having destroyed the old idols, would soon learn how difficult it is to live without them.